Thank you. So when people make reaching movements, they minimize jerk, which is the third derivative of position. And this was shown most famously by Flash and Hogan in 1985, where they had subjects make reaching movements along the surface of a desk, grasping a robotic manipulandum shown here in white, and reaching to targets displayed visually. Now, if you wanted to fit the nice bell-shaped velocity profiles that subjects exhibit when they make these reaching movements, you do a really good job if you minimize the square jerk over the duration of the reaching movements. And the fit is actually this solid line, which fits the data really well. But the question is, why should the nervous system care about jerk at all? And so there have been historically kind of a couple of different approaches, and I'll just go quickly over a couple of them. In the first camp, we have the kind of the ambiguous command cost, which has been proposed for some of the authors, Harrison and Wolpert, that this might minimize variance at the endpoint by reducing the effect of signal-dependent noise. And against another camp represented by Uno et al., which proposed that actually what the nervous system really cares about is the changes in torques. So we've got the symptom of minimum jerk, and what is the cause? Is it a command cost, or is it some kinetics cost? And also historically, this latter camp has kind of fallen to the wayside, so kind of lost out in the debate. But what we'd like to do is bring it back today and consider it in a different way. So it turns out that minimum jerk, or the third derivative position, is equivalent to force rate via Newton. So if we take the derivative of Newton's second law with time, we get force rate is equal to mass times jerk. Okay, and it's also true that in other contexts, we know that force rate has a metabolic cost. This is true in isometric leg contraction movements, like what Tim was talking about earlier, and also bouncing movements, and also leg swinging. And so this leads us to hypothesize that maybe there is a metabolic cost of force rate in arm movements, and that explains why people don't like to be jerky when they reach. So this leads us to our prediction that metabolic cost is going to be equal to mechanical work times some coefficient of muscle work efficiency, which is thought to be about 4.2, plus some cost related to force rate. But since what we're going to do is measure metabolic rate in the lab by measuring their consumed oxygen, we're actually taking the derivative of this equation. So we've got the rate of metabolic cost, the rate of mechanical work, and the force rate average over reaching movements. So how do we do this? Well, we're going to use again a robotic manipulandum, but in this case it's an exoskeleton, so it sits underneath the subject's arms. They're going to make essentially pendular movements with both arms to visual targets. And here I'm showing, as a function of time, we've got the position of both arms, we've got the velocity trace of one arm, and we've got EMG from pectoralis and deltoid, and the mechanical power, which we compute using inverse dynamics. So now the question is, what are we going to do with these two terms in our prediction equation? Well, in the first case, for mechanical work rate, what we're going to do is keep mechanical work constant across the amplitude and frequency range. So you can imagine that if, as we change the frequency of these pendular movements, if we keep amplitude constant, mechanical work is going to go up. So instead we're going to decrease amplitude as a function of frequency, and it turns out we have to use the relationship amplitude varies with frequency to the -3/2. And that will keep mechanical power constant. We do this at 5 different frequencies for our subjects. So here we have an example subject making the lowest frequency reaching movements here and here, and the highest frequency movements here and here. Sorry, it's a bit hard to see, but there are visual targets going back and forth there. Okay, and if you're curious about where this sits in where the natural frequency of moving the arms sits relative to this frequency range, we brought subjects in and had estimated their natural frequency, and we think it's up here somewhere. So we think all of these movements are taking place below natural frequency. For the second term here, it turns out that for basically pendular movements, that we think the force rate cost should vary with frequency raised to some power. I'm going to hand wave my way through what the exact power exponent is. It's not important for this talk. So what did the data show? Well, subjects were able to pretty closely match the specified relationship between amplitude and frequency, which means that they were able to essentially keep constant the mechanical power across frequency. And when we look at their metabolics, what we saw, so these are metabolic cost as a function of frequency, and we saw that it increased pretty significantly. This is just baseline resting metabolic, sitting resting metabolic rate. And if we fit these data, they pretty closely correspond to the power law that we think is operating. And if we parse out this metabolic cost into the different components, we see that there's this relatively small cost related to performing the mechanical work, resting rate cost, and this pretty large force rate cost. So mechanical power, metabolic cost increased while mechanical power stayed roughly constant. So to summarize, metabolic cost increases with force rate, and this suggests that people may minimize jerk partly because it minimizes metabolic energetic cost. So that's it.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy.
A few questions? Yeah, Greg?
Did you measure EMGs? I'm wondering whether, if there's a correlation between muscle activity and your metabolic cost measure.
Yeah.
Why don't you repeat the question?
Oh, yes. So he asked if we measured EMGs and whether there's a correlation between the magnitude of the EMG and the metabolic cost.
Any metric you can imagine stealing from EMG, does that correlate with metabolic cost?
So we see EMG go up as a function of frequency.
Is that integrated over a cycle, or is that peaks, or does it matter?
Yeah, I think it is integrated over cycle. Yeah.
Thanks.
If you take activation models of muscles and just say the cost has to do with some activation measure, does that give the same frequency dependence? Or F dot dependence and so on?
I'm not, that's a good question. I'm not sure about that. I haven't done the activation dynamics test.
Yeah, back here.
What happens when if the frequency becomes zero? So when there's no walk and no rate of change of rate of the force, still we may be utilizing the metabolic energy.
So as the frequency goes to zero,
right,
you're
yes.
asking what do we predict about?
Yes. How can the model be used to predict the metabolic cost in that case? Continuous manner. I know this is the motion. We are considering the frequency motion in this case, but if we gradually decrease the frequency and make it to zero, but still, if there's any external force applied, then to resist that, we have to use the metabolic cost.
So there is a cost associated with just activating muscle, which we think
is not included in this model.
It's not included in this.
Yes.
Yeah. In this model.
All right, so I think we should call it off there so we can all go to lunch. So let's thank the speaker one more time.